All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you are joining us for the first time this evening? Awesome. You are all very welcome. Um, if you haven't heard of us before, the Center for Fiction is the only literary nonprofit in the United States that solely focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we do this through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, our Kids Read program, our First Novel Prize, and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. We also are a membership library. These are library books that you see, and we have a special collection of Caribbean fiction. So if you become a member, you can check out like a curated list of books. I want to say thanks to the Haitian Cultural Exchange and the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival for your partnership in tonight's event. We love working with you guys. And welcome to those of you who are joining via the live stream as well. After the talk, we'll have an audience Q&A, and if you're here, please raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring you a microphone. That's so that the people who are watching on the live stream can hear your question as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can type your question in the chat at any time, and we'll read one of those before we get to the break for the signing line. Myriam was kind enough to pre-sign our books, but we'll be doing a personalization line after the event. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Myriam J.A. Chancy back to celebrate her new novel, Village Weavers. Her last book, What Storm, What Thunder, made a powerful impact on this reader, and I know I'm not the only one. This book, too, leaves you wanting more of her wholehearted storytelling and discerning mind. We're also happy that Cleyvis Natera, author of Neruda on the Park, is back to join Myriam in conversation. Please join me in welcoming them both to the stage.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Bonsoir. Bonjour. Shall I just start? Yeah. Okay. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Center for Fiction for having me back to introduce Village Weavers. And I see some friends and friendly faces in the audience, so thank you too for making the trek. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of an overview of Village Weavers, and I'm going to read a little bit before we, Cleyvis and I, enter into conversation about the novel. Village Weavers is the story of two little girls who are born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in the late 1930s, and then meet in grade school when they're about 7 years old and become completely enamored of each other, as children do, sometimes without understanding why. So they become enamored of each other, and then about a year into their relationship, friendship, they discover a family secret they were never meant to discover, and others conspire to keep them apart. And so then they spend the next several decades into their early 60s coming together and breaking apart, trying to reconcile, what that family secret was all about and what it meant to them, but also figuring out their relationship to Haiti, because the Duvalier regime will send them out into the world, one into France, to Paris, France, and then eventually to Ohio, of all places, and then the other to the Dominican Republic and to South Florida. The way Village Weavers came about, so one of the things that's been happening that's new for me is that when I get the hardcover of the last book that's appeared, I start writing the next book. And this book came out in 2021. What Storm, came out in 2021. And when I received it, I started writing the seed of this novel, what was to become Village Weavers. And that is because my mother passed away in 2019. And so did all of her sibling group, older sister, older brother, younger brother, and a number of her half-siblings. So within a 2 to 3 year period, I lost a whole generation of my family on my mother's side. And what struck me at that point, so I had spent years working through the grieving process, post-2010, with the earthquake and writing that novel. And then when my mother passed, it was like, at least for me, it was a whole world for me disappeared, because she was, not only my mother, but close friend and reader, someone who introduced me to reading, to writing, to Creole, and and I lost that world. And what I realized is that in losing her generation, I was also losing all of the stories that came with that generation of what life was like in Haiti in the 30s, in the 40s, even in the 50s before the regime, and then also what the sweep of the Duvalier regime was like if people survived it. And so in many ways, this novel is dedicated to that generation, and this is the impetus for it. So speaking of that generation and what has been lost, I know that for those of you who are Haitian, you may know about this period, and you may remember this period if you're of a certain age. I wanted to read to you from a section in the novel that has to do with the Expo of 1949 to 1950. Anybody here old enough to have heard about it? One person. Okay, that's good. So I'll read to you from this section, which is in Cece's voice. So the novel alternates between the two girls' voices from the present day in 2002, when they're in their 60s, going back to when they're 7. And in conversation, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the main characters are Simone and Gertrude, Cece and Gertie, and I'm going to speak from Cece's point of view in this section, who will attend the expo with another of their good friends who is named Lou, short for Louise, Lou Lombardo, who's of Italian-Haitian descent, which is also something we don't talk a lot about, but there were Italians there who became part of the landscape. And you'll find out more about the expo as I read this section. So Lou knows about the split between the two girls because she's best friends with both. Whatever happened between the two of you, Lou asks, as the three of them talk about going to the expo. We all used to be so tight in grade school. Cece shrugs, not wanting to admit the truth. Things change, Lou. You know that. Lou gives Cece an enigmatic smile. True, things do change. Anyway, Gertie's a bit of a bore. I tried to get her to come to a rara band practice, and she wouldn't come. Her family told her that everything folkloric was below them and that she had their family name to protect. Can you believe that? I can, Cece says, thinking about the day that Gertie's siblings, Rico and André, chased her out into the street. They think they're too good for anyone. Was it true then, in the end, that the issue is their class difference, that Gertie didn't want anything to do with her because she has no money, no status? A Simbi didn't enchant her after all. So just to note, throughout the novel, there are references to the gods that are called Simbi, who are river gods. Well, forget about her loss. What about the expo? Do you want to come? Please, you have to come. Everyone is going to be there, Lou pleads. I have tickets for all of us and for Lolo, her boyfriend. My parents won't let me go with just Lolo, and they'll be there too. Odette, another friend, lives outside the city limits on her family farm while both Lou's family and Cece's have moved farther into town. My parents will never let me, she says. We're too young anyway. Too young, Lou exclaims, lighting up a small, thin cigar. How about you, Cece? I bet we can convince your mother to let you come with us. All the big stars will be there. Miles Davis, Celia Cruz, Martha Jean-Claude. I mean, everyone will be there. I have tickets to the Jean-Claude concert. Cece is curious, especially because Martha Jean-Claude will be singing. Jean-Claude is a rising star with a series of concerts at the Rex on the brink of international stardom. It is said that she dabbles in vaudou. She sings the old vaudou chants in her repertoire in Creole. She has no qualms about being associated with a religion scorned by the church and that no one with money admits to taking part in. I want to come, Cece says finally, but I don't know if Mamie let me. She'll want to know about a chaperone. Look, Lou says, my parents have a section in the Italy pavilion. We can just vouch that we'll hang out there most of the time. My mother can be the chaperone. She'll agree, she winks at Cece. Okay, Cece replies enthusiastically, even as Odette's face falls at the realization that her friends are planning a major event without her. I'll ask them and let you know. In the end, Lou's suggestion works, and Cece's mother agrees to let her go on the condition that they check in with the Lombardos at least once an hour. When the day of a concert comes, Lolo disappears, lured by friends to lay bets at the cockfighting tent. leaving Lou and Cici by themselves at Simbi, the nightclub where Jean-Claude is to perform, a real club, by the way, really called Simbi. He says he will be back to pick them up in plenty of time to catch the second act. Lou shrugs as he lopes away. They have agreed on a time to meet as well as a meeting point, the foot of a luminous statue close to the Italian pavilion where Lou's parents have a stand. Want to drag, kiddo? Lou asks, her eyes twinkling. Lou is laughing at her discreetly. Cici knows. She bristles at being called kiddo. They are the same age, after all. Sure, she says. I'm game. She has never smoked before and chokes back tears on the first try. Not as easy as it looks, Lou says jovially, patting Cici on the back until she regains her breath. It's a dirty habit anyway. I wouldn't recommend it. Look, look. And she points up toward the stage. There she comes. Oh, what a sight it is. Cici has never seen anything like it, anyone like her, as resplendent as Martha Jean-Claude, who comes onto the stage with arms wide, smiling from ear to ear in such a way that it makes clear to the audience that she knows she is luminous. The copper skin of her bare arms and shoulders glow from within, and her two-tiered necklace made from carved abalone shells sparkles and gives off a blue hue under the stage lights, which produce a halo effect around her form as if she were a heavenly apparition. She is a peacock with all of her plumage out, with her hair piled high underneath a head wrap that has been swirled around large curls to form a crest atop her head. She wears a light yellow cocktail dress with a form-fitting satin bodice held up by thin spaghetti straps and a billowing taffeta skirt sashed with a multicolored checkered madras cloth. Jean-Claude struts across the stage in heels 2 inches high that make her appear to levitate. And as she moves the cord of a microphone across her body expertly so as not to trip over it while making her way toward the waiting crowd, raising the microphone to her lips, the drummers seated on the stage behind her start to beat out a fast syncopation that brings everyone in the audience up on their feet. She begins to sing a Racine, a Roots love song. The lyrics speak of seizing a young man's love, holding on to him until the singer's heart bursts. Jean-Claude makes enticing, circling gestures with her free hand alongside her hip bone. Everyone in the crowd grabs whoever is closest to them, whether woman or man, and dances. Lou reaches for Cici, and they jump up and down to the rhythm of the drums. The crowd presses from all sides. There is no room to move, but it feels like heaven, a true gathering of joy. They are slick with sweat, excited. The air is electric as Jean-Claude continues to sing, and the crowd chants with her. She kicks off her heels as a guitar player strums the melody to Isuli Malado, an invocation to Maîtresse Isili, goddess of the oceans, and they watch, dancing together, as the crowd spills back onto the dance floor to become a wave of torsos and limbs. Jean-Claude's voice deepens as she addresses the goddess. Arms rise up in unison as if the crowd is united in an entreaty, an offering, pleading for a child in need of curing that only Isuli can heal, as the lyrics speak of a woman lamenting the loss of her child to the ocean, of a child descending beneath the surface of the waters never to be seen again. The song makes Cici think of Momo's story about the Simbi. She wonders about the missing child, whether the child is truly missing, or if it has heard the Simbi's song and followed it into another world. I don't have any luck, the singer says. My luck's run out. The crowd dances slowly. Everyone gathered seems to share the pain of the loss of a child, the same grief. The beat slows and Jean-Claude shifts to a ballad about the poor moun innocent, the innocent ones, and the dancing crowd disperses, many singing along approvingly while others move away to light up smokes on the fringes of the dance floor. Lou grabs Cici's arm and drags her to the edge of a tent to do the same. From where they stand, looking back, Cici moves her hips to the rhythm of a crowd, following the movement of the arms back and forth as the spectators swing them above their heads like congregants in a church. Lou is moving against her, following the rhythm, the drums, as if herself a syncopated surface, the taut skin of a drumhead. Her back is turned to Cece as she smokes, and as Jean-Claude moves on to her big hit, her rendition of Oswald Durand's poem Choukoun, an allegory for the beauty of Haitian women, the crowd goes into a frenzy, jumps back on their feet, and Lou's head falls back onto Cece's shoulder. I'll stop there.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you for reading. I'm so happy you're all here today. Myriam is from California, and they brought the good weather. And she's leaving tomorrow, and she's taking the weather.
Oh, no. I'll leave a little
So
behind.
if anybody wants to help me abduct her, don't tell the leadership. It's so good to be in conversation with you.
It's lovely to be here with you too, Cleyvis.
The first thing I wanted to say is that we are here to gather to celebrate this beautiful book, but we're also celebrating Myriam's career. This is her 10th book. So I think that deserves an applause.
Thank you.
I think we both started writing around the same time. I have one book.
I can't be
It's
true.
not a competition, though. It's okay.
I'm older than I look, you know?
I wanted to start by, I would love to hear more about your journey as a writer. When did you start attempting writing as a serious pursuit? And I'm also really interested because you do so much academic writing, and it's such a different medium. I just wondered if you could talk about how you feel like your mastery over different mediums aided or hampered writing this book.
That's a great question.
Let's start with your journey.
Let's start with the journey. Well, so I mentioned my mother. I started reading very, very young. And when I was about 7, we co-wrote a poem together, which was all about eating, getting my book stained with, jam and writing poetry. But what happened at that time is that poem was entered into a contest at school, and the teachers put the poem up at the eyesight for adults. Right, so we're like tiny, and we're all looking up. And I remember thinking, as the adults were going through the halls, that they were looking up at my work. I was getting, they were getting this attention. The poem was getting the attention. And I just remember thinking, that's what I want to do. But I didn't take myself seriously or writing seriously until I failed architecture school. So that's actually what happened. I went to college for architecture when I was 16. Which is usually a second degree in the school that I was admitted to in Canada. But we had a dedicated English professor who, as I was failing the math for architecture, said, "You are a writer." And I said, "Thank God, because I can't do this math." But because I was always reading and writing, and when that teacher told me that, I thought, oh, good, I can just do something I know. I didn't take writing as a serious, career option. So I didn't realize until several books in, like having published several books, but I was a writer. In some way that answers your last question about whether doing both the academic and the creative can hamper one or the other, because it took me a while to realize that I was able to publish academically fairly easily. Not to say that every book was easy to place, but that I had a lot to say and that I could do it because I was a writer first and an academic second, if that makes sense. Because a lot of academics aren't writers, and that's why they struggle, I think. But if you're a writer and you have so much to say in the service of a field, or a group of people, it's a lot easier to set certain deadlines and to say, I really need to publish on this or that topic because it's important for people to know this information. But I can research, but I can gather, which is how I started writing on Haitian women's literature, for example, in '94, because my first position was at Vanderbilt, and the United States government was deploying troops into Haiti in 1994 while I was there from Nashville, from the same base that had deployed during the US occupation of 1915 to 1934. So you start seeing how all of these things are connected, and then I found out doing the research but Haitian women had started publishing in reaction to the US occupation. The very first novel published by a Haitian woman was published in 1929 in response to the occupation. So suddenly, then you have a purpose. I have to write that book because people need to know and need to make that connection, With the creative writing, it is much more, so I was always writing creatively, but it was a longer path to publication because the way I write was not something in my early years that but I would say editors were interested in necessarily hearing or reading, or thought that, audiences would want to hear. Because what I would often hear was that my work was trance-inducing. And I would say, well, that's the point. That's the point. And so I thought, so my first novel took 10 years to publish because a lot of editors loved it right here in New York, but they all said I felt like I was in a trance and I didn't like the feeling. And I thought, well, I'm not going to change the book because that was the point. Yeah. You're supposed to feel entranced. Yeah. So it got published later with People Tree.
I'm so glad that you are not an architect.
What? You think I would have failed?
Well, what I think is so interesting. I mean, because this book, I think the construction of it to me is the construction of someone that's aware of space and aware of layering.
Yeah.
And so I think also, I thought it was so interesting too about just how the characters each navigate space. I think you have this great awareness of space for your characters. But one of the reasons why I was so interested in asking that question is because I feel like on the other side, a lot of fiction writers, I think, have a hard time with placing characters in a real world with real history and events. And Myriam, you did it with the last book that I was fangirling you over the internet. And I feel like with this book, it's you're learning a lot about history. And I think you have this expansive way of looking at the interconnectedness of colonialism and racism and all these other things, but it's very grounded in character and story.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's really aided you, I think, in a richness that is rare, I think, in novels. And so
because I do a lot of research, and I'm sure that's from the academic training, but it's also how, as a literary scholar, I read books. I take them apart, in a good way. I really, think through how did the author put this together and why. I'm always thinking in a way with the author, not why did they do that, but there's a reason this person did this and why did they do it this way. And I think of a novel as really like a building, a form that you then have to excavate, and you can move things into new places. That can be uncomfortable, maybe for the reader, but it's a way for myself to express myself, but also for the characters to have room to move, to be in a new place.
I love that. I mean, I teach that to my students all the time. I have all these prompts where I actually make them walk through the city and find lost objects. You have to learn how to make people leave their space, because so many of us are, prone to just writing about people sitting still and thinking, because that's what we're doing as we're writing, So.
And I tell my students they need to stand up when they write. If you need to move out of your chair, you need to also, when you're being your character, when you're absorbed by the character, you need to feel like you're in their bodies, right? So you need to start moving around in the world as they would in order to write them convincingly.
I love that. That's great advice. So I also wanted to, and I'm sorry to hear too that these editors were such idiots, because I have to say, I feel like and this is something that I think, first of all, we are living in a world where I feel like everybody wants these books to be fast-paced and plotty. And there's something so pleasurable, I think, about your writing, where there is heft. But there is something that I call them mesmerizing in my blurb. Trance makes it seem like you're just passively receiving, where I think what you're doing is really enchantment.
Thank you.
And I'm nice. So glad that you kept doing it and held on to your style, because I think it does require a certain sensitivity. And we all know books are not for all readers, but but I'm glad that you persevered.
Thank you.
So I'm very interested in joy, as you know, and I want to talk about what you found to be an especially joyful aspect of reading this book, and what surprised you.
I'll start with what surprised me and then move into joy. Honestly, and this happens, I think, with every book, every novel that I write, I'm often surprised by the choices the characters make. Because I think sometimes people, who are not writers think that we tell the characters, you must do this, and making a point, the character's going to do that. But actually what happens when you give yourself over to the story is that whatever your purpose was starts falling away, and the character starts saying, I wouldn't do that, or I'm going to do this. So for example, Lou is a very interesting character for me because, so one of the things that I inherited from my mother was a photo album of black and white photos that go back to even actually before she was born. So all these pictures, and in her final days, she made sure everything was labeled with dates, and if she didn't know who somebody was, she would point out something else, about what they were wearing or something like that. So when I started working on the novel, I went back to that album because I wanted to know, well, what were people wearing in Port-au-Prince, and how were they getting photographed when they were going to get their portrait done, or that kind of thing. And I had some pictures of someone who became kind of my type for Lou, just kind of ahead of their time in terms of what they were dressing, the smoking, the teenager who's smoking, and I'm thinking, they were smoking in the 40s, So I just thought it was interesting to see that those images, and then to let Lou just become, this character who just actually at the beginning seems to not care about many things. She'll do whatever she wants, and then you realize she has such depth, depth of character, becomes an activist, and when we find her in France, she's involved in the Algerian resistance movement with her partner, girlfriend, and you might not expect that from Lou, and I didn't quite expect that. But then when Cece finds her, Lou was really deep into this cause and had so many layers of explanation for that. So that was a surprise. But a lot of the characters surprised me in this way, that they but you have to follow the thread of who they are. Yeah. And who they are is not always who you think they are when you imagine them in the first place, because they become their own people, sort of outside of a book.
I think Lou too, one of the things that I loved about the placement is that, she starts out being like kind of besties with like these two girls, Sissy and Gertie, who are like the protagonists of the book. And she remains connected to both of them in different ways. But what I loved about how she functioned in the book too is that in many ways she was an axis by which, I think Cece could measure like kind of like her lack of freedom. Like Lou was able to like access a kind of freedom that, for many reasons, Cece could never access.
Absolutely, because Lou has, she has a lot of privileges that other characters don't have. She has class mobility. She comes from a wealthier merchant class family. So she's a queer identified woman, but she is able to pursue those passions in a way that other women in this time period might not have, but Cece does not. And so she in a way is a light for some of the other girls because she is so daring, but she has class, she has the fact that she's white. She has other reasons why she's able to access to be free in a certain kind of way. And so that's, and you have to keep those things in mind too as you're writing, the characters, like who has what access points in a society, and then how does that govern the kinds of choices they make? And that sometimes the choices they make are governed by things beyond them. They wish they could make another choice, but maybe they can't, So I wanted to explore the psychology of the characters in that way. The joy for me, and this is why I started with this part of the novel, to read, to share with everyone today, was discovering those moments in history that I had heard only a little bit about. So for example, my paternal grandfather was a foreman who built some of the buildings in the expo, some of which are still standing in the port of Port-au-Prince. And I had never really explored what was there, And another young Haitian scholar has actually mapped what it looked like, what the expo looked like, and you can find it on HaitiNet. Actually, I'll just pass that on. But this person created a whole map of what the expo looked like and where the buildings were, where the Simbi Club was. And so for me, that was the kind of joy where I could climb back into time and create these scenes and bring people into the Haiti that was, and as I say, could maybe hopefully one day still be.
Yeah. That's so powerful too, because it's almost like this precipice when we get to that scene where there's like this kind of sensuality and youth and abandon, and then like we it's like a pivot happens very quickly in the book, and then things are bad. so I think it's, you know, it's really I could feel that joy in those scenes, especially there at the expo.
Yeah, well, things are bad in terms of a political turn,
Right.
but things are good in the sense of, at least in Cece's family, the kind of love, you know, that keeps the family from one generation to the next moving towards a future, even if it means moving out of Haiti, you know?
Yes.
So I think, and then on Gertie's side, you know, she falls in love with a Dominican man, and that doesn't take her back to Haiti, but it takes her back to the island.
Yes.
And so on both sides, they find ways to still connect to the Haiti that they're losing, in the process of losing.
Yes.
And so I think what I hope the novel does is shows how, you know, families like theirs and like mine and maybe others, for people here, navigated these very difficult decades. So what the novel does a little differently is not create this idea of migrating out in order to become part of, you know, American society or Canadian society, you know, some other society, but how there's always a kind of returning to the island as a touchstone. And maybe, in this case, not the island, but that, you know, that other girl, that child, you know, who was the connection before everything started, you know, as we say, glisser, started sort of sliding down.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating, because it really does feel like time is moving.
Yeah.
And you can see like the historical atrocities that happen affecting the people, you know, at the most personal level. Well, some of what brought me joy in the book, I'll share with all of you. There's like this folklore, you know, around the Simbi, which you mentioned several times. And I thought it was such a lovely reminder. And it's really consistent throughout the book. I mean, the way that both, you know, mainly Cece really like thinks about this, like from her grandmother, where she first learns it at the outset of the book, I thought was really lovely. And then I really loved how you use nature. Like, I think one of the things that I felt you did throughout the entire book is like the symbolism with the birds.
Yeah.
And especially for both women, how like birds come in and out of their lives. And as they get older, the birds become different things and like meaning different things. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about the title.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, you saw in the passage I just read now that Martha Jean-Claude, who's a real folk singer, Haitian folk singer, for people who don't know. I didn't imagine her as compared to a peacock, and I looked at her pictures and I thought, wow, she just like, so I just thought peacock, even though the male peacock is usually the one with all the plumage, but that's what she looked like to me. And then later on, you'll find out that, well, you find out early because the novel is structured with Cece and Gertie in 2002 going back, remembering the 40s. And then the middle sections will take you to them in their 40s, in the late 70s to early 80s, going back to the 50s through 70s, you know. So when they reconnect in their 40s. But Cece is an illustrator, a children's book illustrator, and she loves birds. And so her memory, her first memory of Gertie is of Gertie as a tody, which is also a bird native to Hispaniola, which is green, very bright green and very small and makes a lot of noise. And so whenever she thinks of Gertie, she thinks of a tody. So a section of a novel is called Totus, which is Gertie's section. But I'll just read a paragraph, which in some ways will hint at what the secret is between the two and where we get the title Village Weavers. So, in Haiti, the village weaver is known as Madame Sarah because it talks all day long, as market women are said to, hovering over their wares under the sweltering Caribbean sun. Since her grandmother was taciturn, someone who didn't believe in idle talk, and who was stern in the home she kept, where Cece, Margie, and their mother lived with her, Simone doesn't really think of market women in this way, as loose and free with their banter. For it is true that some of the women talk a lot and pass gossip back and forth between their stalls when the workday grows long and the heat so stifling that it is difficult to breathe. It is true that the male birds' black hooded heads extend to their chests like the kerchiefs of the women wear to shelter themselves, knotted behind their necks above the shoulders, while the female birds, olive yellow, make her think of Oshun, the maternal river goddess. The birds never bothered Sisi. They were beautiful creatures that wove striking nests made from grassy strips that hung gourd-like from the fronds of palms. They were social, gathering to make colonies that filled the air with cacophony. The males made as many nests as they could in a season, moving to a new nest as soon as the maid started to incubate her eggs so that they could have multiple nests at one time. Eventually, after the weavers had had their broods, the nests dried out, leaving the palm trees on which they hung looking wistfully like abandoned tropical Christmas trees. Simone often wondered if the birds were called Madame Sarah, not just because of their constant chirping, but because of the dexterity of their weaving. She observed when she accompanied her grandmother to the Marché de Fer, the iron market in the heart of Port-au-Prince, that some of the market women busied themselves making baskets for sale from dried striped fronds, as dexterous as the birds, their banter back and forth across the winding paths through the market, punctuating the air with song.
I love that. Oh, I just want you to keep reading to me. I love it. I love how you sound. So this novel has a really interesting structure. One thread follows Sisi from like the present day of the story, which is from 2002 through 2003. And then the other follows the girls as children, and that begins in Haiti, 1941. And I'm just really interested in talking a little bit craft, getting a little nerdy with you, because I feel like was the shape, what did it, all along what you had in mind, or did that emerge as you were writing it? And then I'm also really interested in your choice to tell the past and present tense.
Right, yeah. I'm glad you noticed that, yeah. Because, those are the nerdy choices we make as writers, but...
Well, we are at the Center for Fiction.
Yeah, we are. How many writers are there here? Quite a few.
I think a lot online, too.
Yeah, so we're going to nerd out with you here. So the structure was more or less there from the beginning, because what I wanted to... So I had to really think, though, like, what can I do with a novel form to try to convey the truth of what it feels like to be part of a family that has multiple iterations in different parts of the world, and not everyone is connected to everyone else in a continuous way all of the time. So there's just no way to write a chronological account of families that get fractured for various reasons, economic, political, dictatorships, whatever. And for these little girls in particular, is that their lives do branch away from each other at a certain point, and then they reconnect and they branch out again. So I was thinking, well, how can I create that? So the artifice, if you want to call it that, is phone calls, which we used to actually use real phones, but so that they are in the bookends of a book, so the first part and the last part of a book, calling one another, and you're getting their reactions to, you're getting part of the phone calls and their reactions on either side to either doing the calling or getting the call, and then they're remembering, right? And so the idea was to try to put on the page or in the structure this sense of what trouble comes out of reconnecting to people who were there, who were once dear to us, and are part of these fractured families. And then the middle part, because when they do come back together, was organized more around their solitude in these separate lives, So in the 70s, 80s, and then what brings them to the meeting, and then what occurs in that meeting, and why breaks them up again. And so the structure was more or less always there. The beginning, there's a very small beginning section where her grandmother tells the story of the Simbi, and that came about later because I did have the seam be threaded through, but it wasn't clear why. So the older sister retells the story to Cece when, they're about walking in Port-au-Prince. She tells the story to Gertie during one of those walkabouts. So Gertie also inherits the story, but not through her family, but through Cece's. And so I added that at the beginning. Now, I'll have to find out from readers, what that, it does seem to make it more Cece's story, but it was a way to indicate that family had something that maybe Gertie's family did not have, which was a sense of a folklore and the Vodou history and so forth. So I think it was more or less always there. Oh, and then you were asking about the tenses.
Yes.
So usually when we write hindsight, we write in the past tense, And I have the complexities that French is my first language, and I tend to write in compound verb tenses, which my editor tells me is not very American, right? So when we were working on What Storm, I had to move away from the compound verbs, so I'm going to slip into French, and I don't want to do conjugation. We've all been traumatized by that, but so you don't want to do that anyway. And so I was sort of slipping into that in this book, and then I was taking it out. But then I realized if I write all of the passages in the past tense, you really are feeling as a reader removed from the immediacy, the color, the vibrancy of those periods, especially for those girls.
Yeah.
So I decided the past would be written in the present because in the past it was the present for them. And it makes it much more immediate. And I think it makes so you forget sometimes, I think, when I reread it, I forget that I'm in the past with one or the other character, and then I'm jolted back into the present because of staying in the present tense. So I use markers of dates so that the reader can orient themselves, but we stay mostly in the present tense for the entire novel, so that you always have this sense of like what's happening now and there for the character.
Yeah, there's this great quote from Cece where she's talking about having, and I apologize, I think I'm touching my mic, but she's she's talking about the man that ultimately becomes her husband, and she says, but the present is past. And on page 91, and I thought it was such a good way in which you capture like that intention, because for these characters, so much of the past is alive. Yeah. And I think that the choice to keep it in present tense was really smart, but also like that immediacy remains because they are constantly flooded with this idea of like what the past meant for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a very immigrant reality.
Yes.
That for many people, especially of this generation, the past is so vivid, and sometimes because wherever they ended up, and this is in part Cece's story, doesn't have the vibrancy or the cultural connection of what they left. So the past becomes much more important, So that's part of why I kept that there. Yeah.
We're running out of time. I can't believe it. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you this question because I really want to know the answer. And bear with me because it's a little long. Everybody's like, what? Because I talk a lot.
So the only problem is that you'll probably get a really long answer then.
Well, I hope so. Okay. I mean, this can bring us to the end, I think. In this book, you don't shy away from writing about traumatic events. There is a visceral reality to the terror Cece witnesses and experiences in Haiti, and you demonstrate how once she arrives in Paris, many of the realities of state-sponsored terror await her there in that most civilized place. Everywhere it is the same. Certain people can be disposed of, never heard from again. Cece thinks on page 169. There's this, the PTSD, which I think for me was really interesting to see like how living through a regime where people are disappearing and being murdered, and like you have to walk around and everybody pretends nothing is happening. It was really affecting for me, and especially when I consider the choices that she was making or the choices she couldn't make about her sexual identity, about how she decides to choose a husband and a mate, and ultimately how she decides to go to the USA. This novel makes it clear that there is safety to be gained from wealth, from whiteness, And we see Cece, who can pass as white when she's with her husband, make the choice that leads to her feeling safe and comfortable, but most importantly, trying to find that comfort of home. I want to hear what you have to say about how you perceive the intersection of class and trauma.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question because, I was thinking, for those of you who are familiar with What Storm, What Thunder, which was about the 2010 earthquake, that novel dealt head on with like the traumas of, the earthquake, the lack of rescue, the lack of proper treatment for people who, had crushed limbs, and the people who lost entire families and had to witness, the disappearances. And so I know that was a very difficult read for people. And in comparison, Village Weavers, surprisingly, or some people will find surprising, is much lighter.
It is. It might not sound like that by that long question.
It might not sound like it, but it actually is. It is a lot lighter because it really is about the intimacy of the loss of the relationship between these two young girls, turned women. But it also, attempts to construct those two paths I was describing, two different paths that they take, which, the journeys are occasioned by the dictatorship and the inability to return home, and then having to grapple with, losing friends, to the dictatorship, not because of a disagreement or a family secret, but because of real violence, And some of that follows Cece into Paris, as you described, because some people may not know that the Duvalier regime did have spies outside of Haiti and would pursue political opponents abroad. And so Cece is involved in that kind of clandestinely, in terms of protecting people and helping people. As I mentioned before, she also gets involved with, students who are working with the Algerian resistance movement. And this is around 61, where a lot of Algerian, resistors, people who were fighting for Algerian independence were killed, and thrown into the Seine, which is something the French state didn't acknowledge until 2001. Yes. And this novel finishes in 2002. And so I was trying to, in some ways, show the complex decisions that young people, because they both leave in their 20s, thereabouts, have to make around their own identities, how they connect to other people, what alliances they make and why. And a lot of it does have to do with class, and then color as a component of class, and colorism as a component of class. And so I was exploring with both of these characters, and I should explain to the audience, Gertie is from a middle, more wealthy class, but she is the dark-skinned child in a family of lighter-skinned people. And her older siblings kind of make her pay for that. So they don't treat her very well. And Cece is a light-skinned girl in a working-class family where they pay a lot of attention to equity, to racial equity. So she's raised with this notion that she is not of a better class because she is light-skinned. And this is something that the two girls will have to kind of navigate over the course of their lives. Gertie marries a wealthy, dark-skinned Dominican man who has a lot of wealth, but is a lawyer, is working to help Dominicans of Haitian descent with their papers. So this is like into the 80s, because he is conscious of his relationship to Haitians as a dark-skinned Dominican with wealth. And yet Gertie doesn't quite completely understand that his class standing and her class standing along with him give them access or certain freedoms that maybe someone like Cece, even light-skinned, doesn't have, So she has actually a longer journey in the novel in terms of understanding what is the fight for others all about. And that's something that then both of the characters discover through their daughters. On Cece's side, so she does marry a white man who is wealthy, she comes to the United States, and he is the safe choice for her. And it takes her a while to understand that others are reading her as white. And then they adopt a child who is brown, and that allows her to feel like a kinship, and eventually a realization that she has let herself pass into a white world, which she can't do having that child. And that's when she starts reconnecting at a certain point in a particular year, and this is actually a true fact, the year that this happens, it's in the 80s, all the birds fall out of the sky. I think they're called starlings. I don't know if people have seen, in the Midwest, starlings come at the beginning of the year, and you always know that it's going to be like almost the beginning of spring when they start coming in large numbers actually in January, but it's like a good omen. And there was one year, there was this horrible storm and they fell out of the sky, and there was different reasons given for that. So she notices all the starlings. So back to the bird metaphors, the birds falling out of the sky, and she realizes that she's like those birds in Ohio, just on the edge of a cliff. And she starts looking for foods from the islands. She starts looking for things to give her child so that her child will know where her mother comes from. And it's the beginning of her climbing out of this idea that there is safety in disappearing into a white world. And that's where things start resolving for her. I don't want to give away what happens in the novel, but that's where. So the novel does try to really grapple with class and color, but also certain kinds of inversions there. Because the other thing that happens is that Gertie, spending a lot of time in the DR and with the class privilege, doesn't have to confront racism that has to do with colorism. With Cece goes to the DR when they meet again in their 40s, and she's immediately confronted with color racism and doesn't know how to deal with it, And so I wanted to show that how race and color play out on the Haitian side as opposed to the DR is not quite the same. And also that class has certain kinds of inversions in Haiti that maybe are not so true for the DR. So that even in these two very different families, where Cece's in a family of women and Gertie is in a very privileged class where the parents don't actually pay much attention to the kids, Cece's family in some ways has a lot of richness that people might not expect.
Yeah, I mean, that was probably one of my most favorite things about the book, is that I feel like there is like a subversive quality to the way. I mean, I think that happens to many of us, I think, from the islands, is that there's this, I think people just think that everyone in the islands is poor. And it isn't true. I mean, there's a lot of wealth in our islands. And I think that this idea of like class and color, really, like, it's so complicated because it isn't just the color of your skin.
Right, absolutely.
Right, and how you get treated. And so I thought that you just really handled it really masterfully. The whole thing to me is so fascinating, and I can't wait to read this book again.
Thank you,
Even though I just read it again. So, do we have more time? I don't know.
I think we can open for questions, perhaps.
Should we open it for the audience, or we can keep going? All right.
I saw a hand waving.
I know. I'm like, okay, so we're gonna open it up now for the audience. Does anybody have any questions? I have a lot of questions. If you guys are shy, I'll keep going.
There's a hand there.
Question was just answered, actually. Congratulations, Myriam, on another successful novel again.
Thank you.
Looking forward to reading it, and I've read a lot of Myriam before. Well, you pretty much answered my question. I wanted to know how you dealt with Gertie in the Dominican Republic, knowing the treatment of Haitians, dark skin, lighter skin in the Dominican Republic, whether you ventured into that complexity.
Yeah.
And also to thank you for, I think it's Terry Eagleton who talks about what is fiction, because fiction has so much history in it sometimes. So thank you also for that contribution, for that historical contribution, because you've gone into a time and space in Haiti that I think needed to be brought out. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I do go into those questions in Gertie's sections. If I'd had more time, I would have read from when Gertie meets her husband for the first time, Manuel. And actually, it's a case of mistaken identity where she's, told to look for El Haitiano, the Haitian, and she just, the first dark-skinned person, she thinks, well, that must be the person I'm looking for. And so a case of colorism is what leads to their first meeting, and then that marriage allows her to grapple, with disentangling colorism, but perhaps not as much other kinds of marginalizations. And so it takes her longer to figure some of those things out. But I certainly do that. But yeah, thank you. I hope you'll enjoy the novel and, enjoy the whole expo part. Thank you.
Another question? We have one in the back.
We also.
So I have a question. So a lot of the book is about time and space, and I'm curious as to how you have evolved as a writer now that you're on book 10, if you were to look back at who you were in book 1.
Yeah, so I have to think back at what book 1 was. Book 1 was my PhD dissertation, which was on exile in Caribbean women writing, Afro-Caribbean women writers in exile, Leon Brand, Joan Riley, Emma Norbezi Phillip, and so on. People I've come to know a bit more now, people like Norbezi in person. And at the time, I really felt that I was writing back to my 14-year-old self. And this is to say, like, the first book that had a really huge impact on me was Alice Walker's In Search of My Mother's Gardens, which I got from the public library in Winnipeg, in Canada. So if anybody knows where Winnipeg is, it's very isolated. There was one of her Haitian family, and our parents were best friends. And there was a Myriam in the other family too, so but I remember reading that book, just walking off the bus and reading about all these people, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and I went and read them. And that was my exposure to Black literature. That was not Haitian, because I had been reading some Haitian literature then. And so when I wrote Searching for Safe Spaces, I was writing back to the 14-year-old who didn't know all of this literature existed. But in terms of Caribbean literature, here are all these women writing outside of the islands and what their contributions are to exilic literature. And then the first novel I wrote about a year or two later was Spirit of Haiti, which just was put back in print by SUNY here in New York. And it dealt with the 1991 coup and the Northern Kingdom, the legacy of the Northern Kingdom of King Christophe. So I've always been working on this idea of history and the present. So every novel has a historical focal point and a present day for that novel that is in tandem. What have I learned? Well, going back to Cleyvis's first question, is that the work, for me, the research feeds into the creative writing. So I think even if you're not an academic, I think it's really important to do the research. With Wet Storm, I learned from one of my editors that sometimes you don't need to say as much as as what you found out, So and so to me, for Tin House, I annotated a couple of the books, just with sort of fun notes for a giveaway. And I remember as I was doing it, I was thinking, oh wow, I spent so much time researching this one line, because sometimes but I used to write paragraphs on things that now I just call. What is new for me is I have much more confidence in my writing. Like I said, it took me several books before I considered myself a writer, like this was my primary occupation. But now I feel that I can just write what I want to write, and hopefully will find its audience. So I have much more faith, and I'm having a lot more fun with the line, with the actual lines, and not worrying so much about wanting it to be a certain way. Like I think I used to fret more about the poetics of a line when I was a younger writer, and now I just want it to be poetic, and I just want it to be as trance-like as possible. Yeah. So, yeah.
Enchanting. What did I tell you?
But it's
advertised.
But you know what? I love enchanting and I love mesmerizing. So maybe I'll change the language. But I'll tell you, the reason I actually am okay with trance-like is that I do write a lot about Vodou in my fiction, not in my academic work. And the reason I do is because there's such stigmatization of Vodou on both sides of the island. I think it's called Las 21 Divisiones on the Dominican side. And I just feel like there's so much beauty in Vodou as a healing practice, as a practice that has upheld the people. And so if you feel that feeling of being in a trance, I want that to be a joyful feeling, So if you feel that, and I've transported you, because this is what novels did for me when I was a child, whether I was reading, French novels or American ones, I was transported. So I think the idea of a trance is a lovely one, and that's okay.
I love that. Okay, we have one question here in the front. We're gonna wait for the microphone, please.
We have time for just this one more question.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that when you first started, you already had the structure for the book. How did you set yourself up to create these characters, to bring them to life? Because they sound very intriguing and layered with many rich complications.
Ooh, that's such a good question.
That's my friend, Amelia. Not to take
Is
credit.
it planned?
We went to high school prom together.
Oh, wow! Okay. There's lots coming out here. So for me, I do spend some time not doing like actually written character sketches, but thinking through who the characters are in terms of the arc of the story, but even beyond the story, you know? Because I know what happens to some of the characters after 2002, but it's not in the novel, you know? And I know who they are before they meet, right? Before they meet when they're 7. And then I had to decide what were those moments I was going to really go into in depth. And of course, the way memory works is different for different people, right? Like what I remember of being 10 years old is different from what my father remembers of me as a 10-year-old. So with these characters, I had to think, well, what is the most important, period for this character as a teenager as opposed to the other one? It's not the same, and they might interact in that scene, but how they interact is different than what the other character thinks happened in that scene. So I had to keep very separate which character I was writing about and how they were seeing their lives on its own, separate from the other character. So first it was thinking through the structure, then it was thinking through what are the important moments in that timeline, within the structure, and then it was thinking about their quirks, like the little things that make them who they are, that then would then resurface at different moments. And that made, I hope, made clear which voice was speaking so that it's very distinct. Whether it's Cece speaking or Gertie, or when you have Lou speaking or Momo, you believe that these are the characters speaking because I've stayed within their voices, So for me, getting the voice, and then that also, we didn't talk about this, but was also a little bit about changing the register, wherever somebody speaks in Creole or French or, in Spanish in the Dominican sections, who code switches and who does not, and how do they code switch? And that becomes part of the weaving, so to speak, of the story. So, yeah.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. It's a gorgeous book. Congratulations.
Thank you
I'm so
much.
happy. Thank you for allowing me an opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you for coming out. Thank you,
10
everybody.
more books. 10 more books. 10. No.
Well, there's more coming, so but read this first.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all for coming. Myriam's going to move to the other side of this wall to personalize books, so just head on out those back doors over to the bookstore and buy a book if you don't have one yet, and she'll just be on the other side of those doors. Thanks, and we'll see you all soon, I hope.
Thank you.